The bottom for the drawer is 3/8 to 1/4 inch thick. And typically you don't want to mill a piece of 4/4 material down to that thickness. You're wasting a lot of material. Usually we'll resaw something, and if we resaw 4/4 material, we'll get roughly a half. If you assume you'll lose about 1/4, then you should easily get 1/4 of an inch and maybe closer to 3/8. But what typically happens when you resaw material like that is the piece warps. And so I've got a couple pieces here that actually were not resawed, but they illustrate the concept here. You can see they have both cupped a little bit, and if I push them flat, I can hold it flat, but it's a little tricky with pieces this small to joint them. But that's what I'm going to do. If I ran them through the planer would flatten them and smooth them, and then they'd pop up still cupped afterwards. So I'm going to joint them very carefully. I'm not going to be pushing down very hard. You want to make sure that the jointer you're using is nice and sharp. If it's not sharp, the board tends to vibrate. Particularly thinner boards like this. I'll go ahead and joint these, and then I'll glue them up. As I'm jointing this, I'm trying to push down on the edges of the part where it's contacting the bed of the jointer. You'll see here I've got the push blocks angled a little bit, so I'm not pushing down in the center of the board, just on the edges. Okay, I'm ready to glue these up now. I did run these through the planer after I ran them through the jointer. Just a very light cut. I wanted to make sure both parts are the same thickness and reasonably flat. I jointed the edges, and I just did a dry clamp up to make sure everything lines up well and the clamps are set up. For a glue up like this, I want to have clamps that have a good reference, a good flat reference. F clamps would not work. I would use the K-body clamps for this. I'm not a big fan of those clamps, but for something where alignment's much more critical, the K-bodies are great for that. So I've got these ready to go. I'm just going to put a little bit of glue on here. Now, if I wanted to make sure I didn't get marks on the wood from the glue, I'd put some wax paper across here, and actually maybe I should do that. I just don't have any handy right at the moment. Okay, I've got some pretty heavy wax paper, and if I put that down there, then the glue doesn't interact with the metal and cause those dark spots. These pieces are pretty thin, so I don't want to remove much material on them. So what I like to do here, whenever you put a clamp on, the jaws move a little bit. So what I like to do is get them just a little bit snug, so the jaws are in position, and then I can, there you can hear. Make sure everything's lined up. That looks good. Don't want to get these too tight because they'll pop up, perhaps. But yeah, those are staying nice and flat, and it's it's not a lot of surface area there, so that looks great. I've got the parts sanded, and this is my dry glue up. I don't have any glue in here yet. So it took me a little bit to figure out where I wanted to put the clamps, but I think this is going to work well. So at the back, the drawer back needs to be even with the top edge of the groove back here. So I cut a couple of little pieces on the table saw that just fit nicely in the groove, And so when I install the back, I just push it down against those. I've got one on each side. So that helps to align that. It's of course ideal. It's flush at the top too, which it is. The drawer front needs to be clamped this way and this way. So this worked out well. I'll put this clamp on first, and then I've got some cauls here to make sure that the front doesn't bend or anything, and that should work out fine. So I'll go ahead and take that apart, put some glue in there, and glue it up. Also, I should mention, I did double check, and it's pretty square. Looks good. You can't really measure the diagonals on this, so I'll use a square to make sure it's square when I glue it up. So I'm using a brush here. That is, I think, the easiest for this type of glue application. And I put the glue on the end grain last because the grain tends to suck up the moisture out of the glue, and I don't want it to do that for too long. So here I'm putting the glue on the end grain of the back piece. I'm using the bench to help align the clamps, make sure they're parallel to the drawer. So the back of the clamp is laying on the bench. And then when I put the other clamps on, I've got the bar laying on the top of the drawer, and that also helps align things. So I'll check for square here. Here I'm just checking the clamps, and it was slightly out of square. So you'll see here I'm going to turn one of the clamps a little bit, and that should help to square it up. The drawer is dry now, and I have marked on here where I want to drill for the dowels. So I came in from each edge about 3/8 from the front, which centers it pretty much, in this distance here. And of course I've centered these. One thing to keep in mind, because the back doesn't go down as far, don't come up the same amount here as you do here, right? You need to come up a little bit more so you're into the back. So I'm just going to drill some holes here. I've got a 3/16 brad point bit, and I'm drilling this way because I can visually align the bit with these parts. I want to come in a little bit of an angle, but I really don't care what the angle is. So obviously what's more important is aligned with the back here. Oh, now I just realized I wasn't quite far enough. I drilled into my groove there a little bit, so I need to move that down. The glue on the dowels has dried now, so I'm going to cut these flush. So I'm using a flush cut saw. That was where I drilled the hole in the wrong spot. So I've cut all these flush. Now I'm going to sand the outside of the drawer. As I've clamped this, I want to make sure I don't clamp this too tight because I don't want to break that. So I'm down pretty low, so I'm clamping up here where it's solid. So now I'll do the front. Now, I do have some pencil lines on here, and usually it's better to erase pencil lines if you can before you start sanding, because if you don't, sometimes the lead ends up working its way into the wood, and it actually makes it harder to remove it. These edges pretty flush, but I want to flush them up and remove as little material as possible. So, I got a very slight misalignment there. Sometimes it's a little tricky sanding these corners because you got grain going in different directions. So what I'll do is sand in a circular motion. It's a little bit like a random orbital sander, and sometimes that helps to get rid of some of the scratches there. Particularly at the finer grits. But I'll always finish by going with the grain. And then I'll finish up by rounding over these edges a little bit. You know, a sign of, to me anyway, of good workmanship is that all of these corners are rounded over consistently and just gives a nice look. So I pay particular attention to the corners to make sure they're consistent. Okay, the drawer's all sanded now, and we'll try it out. So that looks good. It fits in there nicely. It's flush. A little bit of play. Now I do have a slightly smaller gap on that side. I'm not sure why. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to sand this a little more, maybe at a slight angle, just to get that gap a little more consistent. But that looks pretty good. It's actually slightly tighter over here and here. So these opposite corners. So I'll fix that by sanding, and then we'll put the bottom in. So I've got the bottom surfaced. I ended up hand planing it, and the grain direction goes this way, parallel to the drawer front. And we do that because if the grain direction was this way and the bottom expanded across the grain, it could affect the fit of the drawer. So a properly made drawer, the grain is parallel to the front. So the first thing I'm going to do, I'll joint an edge to get a good reference, and then I'll square up an end and then cut it to length to just barely fit in between the bottoms of the grooves here. And then I will go ahead and I'm going to rabbet the edge so that it fits in here. Because right now it's a little bit thicker than my groove. And that just gives me a little bit stiffer bottom, and it makes it a little bit easier to fit. If I had made the groove to match this, then, you know, trying to match it all the way around, this just makes it easier by making a rabbet. Plus, like I said, I get a little bit stiffer bottom. So I'll go ahead and cut this to size, and then we'll do the rabbet on the router table. I've got the bottom cut to size now, and I'm going to create the rabbet around the edge. Now, the rabbet only needs to be on the sides and the front. The back doesn't need it, since the bottom slides in from the back. So I've got a 3/4 inch straight bit in here, raised up maybe a 32nd, and I'll take a few passes and sneak up on the fit. I've got the rabbet now on 3 sides. I've sanded everything. I've kind of knocked these corners down a little bit, and I've had to sand this side a little bit more. For some reason it was a little bit snug in here. And you need to be careful, because it's easy to break off this piece right here. So this fits in here nicely now. So I've got a nice, you know, even rabbet all the way around there. That looks nice from underneath. So the last thing I'm going to do, I'm going to put a screw in here, but first I'm going to back this out just a little bit, because it's going to be fixed here and can expand and contract into the front groove a little bit. So I'll push it all the way in, bring it back maybe a 1/16 or so. Find the middle here, find the middle of where the back is, and then I'll drill and countersink a hole there. Okay, there we go. Now that is just a touch looser than I'd like, but that still works pretty well. So I'll do some light touch-up sanding, and then we can put some finish on it.